Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Winter Show. I'm Helen Allen, the executive director of the show, and I'm delighted to host today Polymaths of Early America, Art, Knowledge, and the Preservation of History in collaboration with our dear friends, the Preservation of Long Island. So thank you to Jackie Powers and our friends at Preservation Long Island. Today's talk brings together leading scholars to explore the extraordinary individuals whose ideas and creativity shaped the nation across disciplines. This timely conversation considers how art, objects, and images preserved memory, identity, and knowledge across many generations. We're proud to offer this program as part of the Winter Show's ongoing benefit for East Side House Settlement, with all proceeds raising critical funds to support the organization's vital educational and community efforts. So thank you all so much for being a part of today. And I'm delighted to introduce you to Susan Fales-Hill, who will be leading this discussion with our esteemed scholars and panelists.
Thank you so much, Helen, and welcome everyone. We're really delighted today to present to you three seminal figures in the formation of our republic. Jim Basker, who's in the far end there, will present to you American Revolutionary War veteran and ordained minister Lemuel Haynes. Lauren Brinkat will present astronomer, clockmaker, nautical instrument maker, investor in silkworm farms. Ephraim Byram, who has the advantage of being the introductory portrait there. And dear Harold Holzer will present surveyor, inventor, Shakespeare expert, military tactician, and 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. All of these polymaths were of humble origins and rose to astonishing heights. They really are the embodiment of American possibility. We will consider them and the artifacts and the objects by which we remember them. And we're doing all this in the context of the 250th birthday of our republic. And for that reason, we will be going in chronological order because it seems fitting to go from literally the founding in 1776 to what is known as the second founding after the Civil War. Let me now introduce these eminent historians and polymaths in their own right. I have Jim Basker, who has been for 35 years a professor at Barnard, and for 30 years the head of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. These are not just jobs, these are vocations, these are marriages, and your beautiful wife of at least as many years is also with us, the fabulous Angela Villo. The Gilder Lehrman Institute is the leading nonprofit focused on K-12 history and civics in the United States, with 38,000 affiliated schools across 50 states. Jim most recently curated a panel of exhibitions for schools called Declaration 1776, The Big Bang of Modern Democracy. Copies are already in more than 100 schools. The Gilder Lehrman Institute also sponsors public programs such as book breaks every Sunday at 2 p.m. For me, it's an appointment. I highly recommend it. It's online. You can watch it in your pajamas, and in an hour, you'll become much smarter. And for 10 years, GLI has partnered with Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton to offer EduHam, a program for middle and high school students. Jim is the author and editor of numerous anthologies of African American history and American history, and most recently, this incredible book, Black Writers of the Founding Era. I highly recommend it for gaining a more ample understanding of the founding of our country. Next, we have Lauren Brinkat, who is the Chief Curator and Director of Collections for Preservation Long Island, which, as many of you know, is a nonprofit committed to celebrating and preserving Long Island's diverse cultural and architectural heritage through advocacy, education, and stewardship of historic sites and collections. Thank you for reminding the world that Sag Harbor is not merely the site of the flagship Love Shack Fancy Boutique. She's an editor and author of the publication Promoting Long Island, The Art of Edward Lang, and the catalog for the forthcoming exhibition, Wood and Water, Furniture on Long Island, 1660 to 1860, and that opens on July 2nd of this year, so we can all go and see that. And last but certainly not least is our very own Harold Holzer. He's the director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute of Hunter College, a job he's held since 2015. Before that, for 23 years, he was senior vice president at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's the author, co-author, and editor of, count them, 55 books on Abraham Lincoln and the political and material culture of the Civil War. Needless to say, you know your stuff. He earned a 2008 National Humanities Medal. He also won the 2015 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize for his book, Lincoln and the Power of the Press, and he's the recipient of the 2025 Guggenheim Fellowship. He also co-chaired the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission by appointment of President Clinton, and he currently chairs the Lincoln Forum. And his latest book, which I also highly recommend, is Brought Forth on This Continent, Abraham Lincoln and American Immigration. It will remind you that history does indeed rhyme. You can just change the names of the groups. It's the same mentality. And it was very humorous to discover that anti-immigrationists at the time called themselves Native Americans. They didn't quite understand what those words meant. So it's going to be over to you, sir, but before we proceed, I have to say, at a time of historical Baudelarizing and revisionism, the three of you are doing God's work in terms of preserving our history and preserving the truth for future generations. It's very important. So we are going to begin with you, Jim. Please tell us about this somewhat hidden figure, Lemuel Haynes, who was literally present at the creation.
Thank you, Susan, and let me add my thanks to hers for all of you braving the weather to be here. I can do the polymath part of Lemuel Haynes very quickly. He started life as a farmhand. He was a soldier, a poet, an essayist, a pastor, a preacher, a community leader, and a civil rights advocate. But he's one of the figures from the founding era, among so many in the Black community, who've been completely forgotten in our national memory. So it's a delight for me to try to flesh him out for a few minutes with you. Lemuel Haynes has mysterious origins. He was an illegitimate child born, we think, to a Black father and white mother. There's still scholarly dispute about who the mother actually was. At about the age of 5 months, he was rather surreptitiously placed with a family in Granville, Massachusetts, who raised him. A man called David Rosen, his wife. He was a blind farmer, but a deacon in his Christian church. His wife, Elizabeth, who became something of a maternal figure to Lemuel Haynes, at least according to his later memory. And he grew up there, very well educated, as officially an indentured servant, but clearly training to be a Christian missionary or preacher. But one of the first things that happened is when he was freed at age 21, is he joined the militia, the Granville militia. So, of course, in April 1775, when Concord and Lexington happened, the Granville militia, like the others in New England, were called to Boston. So Lemuel Haynes was in a militia group that joined in the siege of Boston, camped largely on the Cambridge Common, but all around Boston. And in that experience, early as a soldier, one of more than 5,000 African Americans who fought in the American Revolution, Lemuel Haynes did some remarkable things. He wrote a poem called The Battle of Lexington. We're not sure exactly when, but it was within days or weeks of the actual battle at Concord and Lexington. That poem circulated in manuscript, but was not published until the 20th century. But we can now recognize that it was the first battlefield poem in American history. Not the first Black battlefield poem, but the first battlefield poem, probably compiled based on some of the eyewitness experiences of soldiers who were there, because he was in the same camp with them for months in Boston. He also, still as a soldier, went on to Ticonderoga. When the Declaration of Independence was issued, you'll remember that Washington famously ordered that it be read to his troops everywhere, which is probably unprecedented in the history of commanders-in-chief. Lemuel Haynes read the Declaration and immediately responded to it by writing an essay. He quoted the famous "all men are created equal" passage as the motto for his essay, and the essay, entitled "Liberty Further Extended," was an argument for an end to slavery in America, written in 1776. And so at that moment, Lemuel Haynes may have, in some sense, begun the civil rights movement in America. In response to the Declaration, he's writing for a claim for equal rights for African Americans. He went on after the Revolutionary War to train as a minister, and his training was with different pastors in Connecticut and Massachusetts. He became, in 1785, the first ordained black minister in the Congregationalist Church, and he wound up in Rutland, Vermont, where he was pastor to a parish of white people for 30 years. And meanwhile, he had married a woman called Elizabeth Babington, who came as a 20-year-old teacher to Granville, and they had connected. The tradition is that she actually proposed to him. She was so impressed by his preaching and his ardor as a Christian leader. They would eventually have 10 children. At least 7 of them outlived their father. And so he had descendants, children, who were living in the 1860s all the way into the 1880s, where they would have experienced, I hope, some of the eventualities that he hoped for in his lifelong opposition to slavery. He had many other firsts in his life. He was not only the first ordained Congregationalist minister, he wrote the first battlefield poem. He was the first black man to receive an honorary degree from Middlebury College in 1805. He ministered all the way to the end of his life in 1833. He is supposed to have written and delivered 5,000 sermons. He was a prolific writer, supporter of the Federalist Party, an admirer of George Washington, an opponent of Thomas Jefferson, who he deeply distrusted the French Revolution and all the radical developments happening in France in the 1790s and early 19th century. But above all, he was a leader in his community, that he was pastor in a mixed-race community, in a white community, but his mixed-race family were central, speaks to another era and another, perhaps, set of possibilities in American history. Now, I know that we have slides here that are going to reproduce a couple of the artifacts that, to some degree, preserve Lemuel Haynes for us. One is the engraving that appeared in the front of a biography of him in the 1830s, just a few years after he died. But the engraving is clearly derived from a painting sometime in his life. We don't know where that painting is or if it survives, but it's the only image that we have of him that's a full portrait. The other, unusually, is an object, a tray, that turned up in England, is now in the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, and it depicts him in a pulpit, we think in 1814, commemorating one particularly powerful sermon. Next to him are 2 white men. One is the mayor of New Haven, and one is Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale, who clearly were supporters and were, I think, anti-slavery advocates in their own right. We don't know all the history of this tray, but it's an instance of where an object like this can preserve a memory and a moment, perhaps a fundraising moment. We're not sure of its purpose at that time. But I'm just happy to be able to introduce you to Lemuel Haynes, because he's one of those people who've been forgotten from the founding era and who matters really very much today.
Isn't it possible, Jim, that this tray was an object used to raise money in the same way that the Wedgwood medallions of the kneeling slave?
I think it's entirely possible. And many of these kinds of things were developed in the 19th century, in parts of anti-slavery movements on both sides of the Atlantic. So we just don't know the specifics, but we're hopeful.
And the catalog for RISD says that this tray was probably based on a posthumous biography of him. And there was a quotation from someone who had witnessed this oration and said it was so powerful that it brought everyone to tears. So, yes, thank you so much. So we move from him to a man who was at the epicenter of early capitalism, Ephraim Byram, born in 1809 in Sag Harbor. As we know, the focus of the American economy in the early years of the Republic was the sea, shipping, and he's at the epicenter of shipping, and then sees the transition from shipping to industrialization. So please take us away.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Susan. Thank you so much, Jim. And I do want to extend some gratitude to Helen Allen and to Winter Show for giving Preservation Long Island the opportunity to present this panel, to bring together some incredible thinkers in American history, myself excluded from that distinction. So I just feel incredibly honored and privileged to share the stage with all of you today, and to share with all of you the life and likeness of Ephraim Byram. And Ephraim Byram was born in Sag Harbor in 1809. He didn't come from a family of any particular wealth or education. His mother and father, Eliab Byram and Cynthia, had moved from Groton, Connecticut. There are strong relations between Connecticut, coastal Connecticut, and Long Island, of course. And he actually trained in the shop of his father, Eliab Byram, who was a woodworker. He was a builder of architecture, so the armory in Sag Harbor. He worked probably on shipbuilding as well. And so that was the beginning of Ephraim's training. But he became intensely interested in mechanical and intellectual pursuits, as is alluded to in this portrait, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But to give you a little bit of an idea of what's going on in Sag Harbor in the first half of the 19th century. So he's born in 1809. This is a time where Sag Harbor is really coming into its own during, the founding era. It becomes an official federal port of entry. So there's customs collecting that's happening through Sag Harbor. So this is a place that is globally connected. Lots of shipping happening here. There's some thought that, some tonnage in Sag Harbor at some point exceeded what was coming through New York City. So this is an extremely important port on the east end of Long Island, surrounded by mostly agricultural communities. Sag Harbor becomes this retailing and manufacturing center. And as the decades go on, in the first half of the 19th century, whaling becomes the biggest business in town. And is the largest and most important whaling ports in the Northeast. And so Byram's career really ebbs and flows with the whaling industry, this time of great economic transformation, not only in Sag Harbor and Long Island, but in the United States as well. And so his career is a really interesting one. We know a bit about it because his account books survive. So he did do a lot of repairing and making of nautical tools and equipment. So all these devices that are essential to whaling navigations. He also was part owner of a brass foundry. So he is also, making clocks. He does all of the tower clocks for buildings that are being built in Sag Harbor during this time. So the Old Whalers Presbyterian Church, that wonderful Egyptian revival church, he creates the tower clock for that. It was in the steeple, which sadly is gone, which came down in a hurricane. But that tower clock didn't survive in that tower for too long because of wind, and they had to take it down. But he's doing all sorts of things for public buildings on Long Island, in Connecticut, and really throughout the country as well. He does the tower clock for West Point. He does a glass dial for the Pennsylvania State House. He also does the tower clock for New York City Hall as well. So he gains a lot of renown and reputation for the extreme accuracy of his mechanical equipment and his clocks. He also does bookbinding as well, and as Susan mentioned, was really interested in natural history, was interested in horticulture, so speculated in silk production and selling mulberry trees. So really a person who dabbled in a lot of different activities in this moment of great boom in Sag Harbor during the 19th century. But he is most remembered, aside from his tower clocks, for his interests in astronomy. And that's how he is remembered through his portraiture. So this is a really fabulous portrait of him. He is 25 years old and is painted by Sag Harbor artist Orlando Handbeers. Of the bunch, I think Ephraim Byram may be the most obscure of all the individuals we're talking about today, but some of you may recognize him because Preservation Long Island was thrilled to add it to the collection early last year. So this is actually our 1-year anniversary. We acquired him at Christie's in January and came from a collection in the Midwest. So we're very excited to bring him back home to Long Island. Orlando Handbeers was a very technically gifted artist, active in Sag Harbor. We don't know a ton about him, but he did many portraits of the whaling community, sea captains, merchants, all these people who are accumulating wealth in Sag Harbor during this time. I neglected to include an image here, but it is actually signed by the artist. And Orlando Handbeers didn't sign a lot of his work, but on the canvas on the back, it says O.H. Beers. He also identifies the sitter. It says E.N. Byram and then 1834. So it's everything you would ever want in an early American portrait. Some casual confidence that is exuded in this portrait as he leans against an object of his own creation, as he's set among the clouds. That globe actually survives, which is in the collections of the Sag Harbor Whaling and Historical Museum, and was gifted to them by his daughter, Loretta Sophia, and is just a really amazing survival of Byram's career and his production. And there are a lot of different things associated with Byram's life that's still scattered around Sag Harbor, preserved, his memory preserved through these objects. And this is a really wonderful thing. So it's a celestial globe. So it's depicting, or supposed to depict, the night sky as seen from Earth. If you look closely, there doesn't seem to be much paint on it. Actually, if you get under it, you can see some remnants of paint of the stars and the constellations. So this would have been a beautifully painted piece. It is a scientific tool, but it also is a decorative object. It is kind of like a piece of furniture. And I was talking with my friend and colleague, Grant Katermos, about this earlier and observing that the legs on it are like a sofa from this time period, which is not surprising given that Byram was trained in a woodworking shop. His father was a furniture maker. And so it's great to think about that he probably made this piece as well. So his portrait's done in 1834. That's the same time he makes this globe. And that's really at the precipice of a career that would really take off. And in the same year he makes the celestial globe, he makes an orrery, or universal planetarium, which is a model of the solar system. And so interest in astronomy really is strong at this point. In 1833, there was a Leonid meteor shower, which was all over the news. There was a solar eclipse a few years earlier, and famously, like our founding fathers, Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, is very interested in the celestial world. And this orrery, he made it in Sag Harbor, and then it traveled at least to Washington, D.C., and was exhibited here in New York City at the American Institute, where it won a gold medal. And this really garnered a lot of attention for him, and he got praise from former Vice President John C. Calhoun for this work, and he even said that, this mechanical genius, this original genius is what they called him often in the newspaper, was deserved of greater renown for just the quality and the scientific knowledge that he put forth into the things that he created. And so it's a really fabulous thing, and really kicks off this career that Byram has. And I think it's interesting and wonderful that that's what he chooses to include in his portrait, is him standing next to this piece he was clearly proud of. So this is also another portrait of him by Orlando Beers. This is in a private collection, and it's just really great. He is full length. So this thing is 82 1/4 inches. So this is a full scale portrait of him, really unusual for the artist, and that he painted him twice in the 1834. So really speaks to the significance of Byram in the community. And really fun fact about this one is that it was previously in the collection of Andy Warhol. So this is a portrait that has allured people for many years, and it is really striking. I do hope to see it in person, hopefully this week. And so it's a fabulous thing, and you see him in fantastic costume from the 1830s. So he's in this long frock coat, which is informal wear but fashionable, and he's wearing some great silk and leather dress shoes. And so just a great depiction of a young, fashionable person in the 1830s. And again, choosing to emphasize his interests and pursuits in astronomy. So that telescope there is probably also an object of his own creation. And Orlando Beers is known to get a little romantic with his landscapes. And so that's clearly not Sag Harbor. Many of you are familiar with the east end of Long Island, and there are no mountains there. But it is just a great thing. And I just love you have the full moon and you have the stars in the sky. And, this is something that really is what he is remembered for, but also his mechanical genius, his intellectualism. He's even included in Fowler and Wells' Self-Instructor as an example of a person who is very a keen observer. And I do want to end my brief little chat about Byram to think about a poem that was written during his lifetime. So this was written around the same time this portrait was done. So I'd like to think about some cross-pollination that's happening between poet and artist in the creation of this. And so there's a poem published actually in the newspaper in 1834. And just to quote it briefly, it says, "I gazed upon thee when the host of stars poured their pale light upon thy paler brow. Yes, Byram, rouse thee from thy dreaming, thy charming dream. Look on the world, observe its busy scene. Bring to its use thy mind of patient thought, thy wealth of talent, thy ingenious skill." So that is Ephraim Byram.
Certainly a figure that deserves to be remembered. And it's important to note that clock towers were very significant for people because most people could not afford watches. And so it was how people could tell time. Now, Mr. Holzer, last but not least, please bring us to our second founder.
So I have, I guess, the blessing or the burden of talking about someone who you all know very well. So I'm going to try to tell you about certain aspects of Lincoln that you may not know about, and that actually fit in and dovetail nicely with what we've heard about the two subjects who introduced this program. First of all, as you look on the first known photograph of Abraham Lincoln, taken when he was elected to Congress in 1846, Lincoln got his start, speaking of ministers and preachers, by going to Sunday services at the Little Pigeon Creek Baptist Church, listening to interminable sermons by the minister, and then stepping outside with his friends, standing on tree stumps, and reciting the sermons almost verbatim in the minister's unique way of talking, until his father ambled over and occasionally knocked him off the tree stump for being disrespectful. It's a demonstration of an extraordinary memory, if nothing else, and a gift for public speaking and mimicry that Lincoln had and boasted through his entire life. Before I do my riff, I'll tell you that there's also a connection between Lincoln and Byram. What are the connections? First of all, in Lincoln's first major visit to New York City, well, actually not, and I should know better, his second major visit to New York City, not the Cooper Union visit, but his return a year later as president-elect, Where does he stand to greet well-wishers? Well, first the Astor House, which no longer exists, but he also stands on that little balcony on the second floor of City Hall, right under the clock tower, probably with the clock. There is no image of that, even a sketch by the Harpers or Leslie's artist who covered it. But there he was, telling of people massed below in what he surely would not know would become the City Hall parking lot, telling them all, I don't give speeches, but it's great to see you and stay tuned, basically, and not in that vernacular. But Lincoln the Polymath, what can I tell you that will astonish you about this man who we know was focused on union and slavery, the preservation of one and the containment and ultimately the eradication of the other? Susan gave a hint, and it's especially meaningful today, that Lincoln was also, in an era of nativism, was a champion of immigration. He evolved to that point, just as he evolved on emancipation and black rights. But by the Civil War, by the dawn of the Civil War, when elite regiments like the 7th Regiment were marching down Broadway to join the war effort, Lincoln understood from the beginning that to save the Union would require a wide range of people, including the foreign-born. And while he was naturally comfortable recruiting German Americans because they were Republicans who had supported him, he did find himself working with the first Archbishop of New York, Dagger John Hughes, as he was known, to recruit prominent Irishmen as well. Irish Democrats did not support Abraham Lincoln or the Republican Party. In fact, that opposition metastasized into anti-black draft riots in 1863. But in 1861, 100,000 people gathered peacefully at the south side of Union Square in front of the equestrian statue of George Washington to rally not for their fatherlands, but for the defense of their adopted country. And by 1864, Lincoln had signed an act to encourage immigration, which did not quite meet his expectations. He had proposed it in his annual message in December 63. It was the equivalent of a State of the Union message. What he wanted was for the United States, think about this, think about how far we've come. He wanted the government to pay for the overseas passage of new immigrants. He wanted us, the government, to underwrite their arrival in this country. Congress would not go that far, but he did set up a system of private loans to, unfortunately, indenture some immigrants to repay this mortgage of on their future, but bringing in hundreds of thousands of immigrants. Hundreds of thousands had come, but they stopped coming when the first guns of the Civil War were fired, understandably. He resumed that flow. Then there was a second bill in 1865, and no positive immigration legislation for 100 years until Lyndon Johnson fathered the bill that would guarantee some equitable immigration to people from Southeast Asia who had supported the United States. And now it's 60 and a half years since that last positive immigration law was passed. So that's a history I would like to talk about for a second. Susan mentioned some of his various occupations. It's interestingly, his career took off. Well, he was born in 1809, as you know, as well, right? So he's the same age as your guy. And he has his breakthrough moment in 1834, where on his second try, he's elected to the Illinois State General Assembly. But you know about his political rise. What else did he do? Well, he was a pretty competent surveyor and draftsman. He was a rather bad postmaster. In fact, he was such a bad postmaster that, and principally because he read everyone else's newspapers before they arrived, that they didn't know what to do. They closed the post office and consolidated it to a nearby town. He was a soldier briefly. He said the only battles he engaged in were against mosquitoes, not against living Native or genuine Native Americans. It was an Indian war in Illinois. He was also a student of the Bible, committed much of the Bible to memory. His speeches, his later speeches, are adorned with biblical references. And also Shakespeare, he had the same knowledge of Shakespeare. He had a great facility, which is reading something maybe twice and never forgetting what he had read. And unlike most artists of the day, he did not say, in the words of Shakespeare or in the words of the Bible. He would simply say, a house divided against itself, or as was said 3,000 years ago, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. But in terms of sermonizing, read his meditation on the divine will as beautiful an expression of the trepidation people should feel in quoting or citing God's backing as anything, I think, an ordained minister or well-versed student of religion and the Bible could say. He was also a student of astronomy. He loved astronomy. And when the National Naval Observatory installed a giant telescope, Lincoln would not only go there, he would take people there to gaze at the stars. One of the photographers who took a picture of him in Illinois, not this fellow, but 13 years later, was John Adams Whipple of Boston, who had earned his fame taking pictures of the planets and the stars. What is the biggest thing you don't know, or most people don't know about Lincoln? That is Abraham Lincoln's invention. He is the only American president to actually hold a federal patent. And this is the design. Scholars have always said he made it. I don't believe that he made it. I mean, he could split rails, but I don't think he could make a polished model like this. He did have a mechanic in Springfield who helped him with this. What is it, you may ask? And so must have the patent office said, what is this? It is a device to lift vessels above shoals and shallow waters. A system of membranes around the side of a ship, you see them in sort of greenish there, that would be filled with air by a system of bellows and raise ships. Now, Lincoln was a devoted fan of infrastructure improvements, but the federal government was not dredging rivers and canals at the rate he preferred, so this was the alternative. If you can't lower the water, you raise the boat or something, and this was the device. It was never put into practical use. The bellow apparatus probably weighed so much that would actually make the ship lower than it needed to be, so it was however, the system is the same as was later used for U-boats and submarines. You pump air and raise the vessel. So he was on to something. And, he didn't really have an abundance of pride about this. When he got to Washington, his son went off to look at this model on display in what is now the National Portrait Gallery, which was then the Patent Office. He was bored at the time. He was leaving Congress. He wasn't a candidate for re-election. He had no political prospects. So he did what any of us would do. He invented something, he got a patent. He wrote poetry and engaged in everything else that interested him. Then this is the project I'm working on now. This is my Guggenheim project. Lincoln once said to an artist, I don't know why all you painters want a picture of me unless it's because I'm the homeliest man in the state of Illinois. And yet this man, who was not handsome, although he looks pretty good in paintings and photographs. That's one of the mysteries of those arts. This man who was awkward, gigantic, managed to arrange for the promulgation of his image in a variety of media over the period of his fame. Photographs, paintings, which spawned engravings and lithographs, and sculpture. It is extraordinary, as busy as he was, how much time he spent making himself into an icon, not just becoming an icon. My argument is that he was an active participant in his own canonization, in a sense.
Can you touch briefly on his knowledge of Shakespeare and how that influenced his statecraft and his leadership and his...
Well, he was exposed to Shakespeare not through a collected Shakespeare, as some people think. he picked up a book called Scott's Lessons in Elocution, which was mainly a primer on how orators should gesture. He wasn't a gesturer, so he ignored that part of the lessons. But this 800-page book included soliloquies that he committed to memory and used forevermore. I don't think he was as indecisive as Hamlet, and his favorite play, ironically, a play about assassination and rebellion and deceit and a difficult first lady, was Macbeth. He said nothing equals Macbeth, but he knew his Shakespeare. He went to the theater many, many times during his presidency. He just adored Shakespeare productions. He would see, if a repertory company came to visit, he would go 2 or 3 times to each production, and he went to Ford's Theater many times. He saw Edwin Booth and John Wilkes Booth in Shakespearean productions. He just knew the canon. And I don't know if it influenced his life. I think it influenced the cadences of his writing, the beauty of his own writing, although he did write poetry and inspire poetry, none of which obviously approached Shakespeare.
Thank you for that. So since we're right here with a portrait, let's dig into, and since we're at the antique show, let's talk about portraiture in America. And I want to start with you, Jim, because I want you to talk a bit about the absence of portraits of Lemuel.
There's a parallel actually in the career of Phyllis Wheatley, for whom we have one engraving derived, we think, from a painting, but we're not sure, and so on. In any era, the people you paint, there are reasons that people paint and are painted, and their images are collected. And so it may speak, obviously, to some sense of social hierarchy and who is worth remembering. Certainly, Lemuel Haynes achieved prominence in his own community, and from time to time, his memory has been brought back visually. One of the things I found interesting, we were talking about before this panel, is the Bennington Museum has 2 paintings of Lemuel Haynes made in 1939 and 1940 by artists who were funded by the WPA. And so locally, there was some sense of memory of him up in that part of the country. And these WPA-funded artists found him a worthy subject. But that's 100 years after the initial biography with the engraving, and another 85 years have passed quietly. I think in our time, the best way for Lemuel Haynes to be recognized, and I do think he's a tremendously important figure, is in a documentary film. But again, as we were talking about Hollywood's blind spots and so on, someone needs to embrace that idea and make the film. I mean, the arc of his life, from an abandoned baby to a Revolutionary War soldier to a civil rights leader to pastor of a white congregation, is really quite amazing as an arc of personal heroism, but also as a model of possibility in a time when those possibilities really began to fade away in the 19th century.
Thank God we do have that piece of writing of his, which is at the Houghton Library at Harvard. Yes. That incredible essay.
We do have some, but again, a few manuscripts. But there were.
Well, he didn't get to Lincolnize himself and
5,000 sermons.
Yeah.
Where are they?
Yeah. Lauren, do you want to speak a little bit about the importance of portraiture to the sort of American bourgeoisie in the 19th century? It's very interesting that there are all these portraits of Ephraim Byram, and it was very common, of course, for prominent merchants to have themselves painted. But do you want to speak to that a little bit?
There's a lot of this happening specifically in Sag Harbor because of the amount of wealth that is accumulating there because of the whaling industry. And you have these individuals who are invested in whaling, are sea captains, and those are the primary subjects of people like Orlando Hand Beers, and also Hubbard Latham Fordham, who is a distant cousin of Beers, who is also very active and prolific on Long Island, along Sag Harbor, coastal Connecticut as well. And so this is where you have communities like Sag Harbor, you have communities like New London across the Sound, these places of lots of mercantile wealth. And so these are the subjects that are being painted by these kinds of of artists during this time. And so Byram's a little outside of that, but is someone who does garner some renown for his involvement in promoting this business in different ways. And I think it's really interesting that, at the height of whaling in Sag Harbor, 75% of his business is working on these whaling ships. And so there are a couple of portraits of Byram. So those two are, him as a young man at 25, but there are daguerreotypes. There's also a later portrait of him done by Hubbard Latham Fordham, who is believed to have taught Orlando hand beers, and he is, a gaunt older man. But we remember him through these works that are just really captivating examples of a really wonderful artist who's working in a fairly local place on Long Island, but is a community that is connected to a much larger world as well.
Thank you for that. So we come to this portrait, which to me stands in marked contrast to the photography of him, which was obviously made for popular consumption. And this is a more noble portrait. It seems to have a link to Gilbert Stuart's 1796 portrait of Washington, the Lansdowne portrait, which shows him with the Constitution. This is Lincoln as statesman for the ages. And so please tell us about this portrait. And there's a funny story about the sitting.
Well, Lincoln was a willing subject for artists during the 1860 political campaign, for sure, because he wasn't that well known visually or even reputationally. He was a kind of a dark horse nominee in 1860, known in Illinois, but not nationally. So he posed for artists, a surprising number of artists who came to Springfield to create portraits that would be then taken back to respectively New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, and engraved or lithographed, and then used for popular consumption. The artist had a lot of problems capturing him. First of all, he was unusual looking. Second, he wouldn't sit still. He did not pose in the manner of Washington for Gilbert Stuart. He did not have 3 hours at a time to pose rigidly. He said, "You can take me on the jump while I open my mail." That was his usual prerequisite. So they commissioned photographs to aid them in modeling him, in addition to life sittings. So as a result, we have a huge number of additional Lincoln photographs among the 113 or so poses that he sat for between 1846 and 1865. And although this is romanticized, there was a photograph involved that was commissioned to serve as a model. The artist is named Edward Dalton Marchant. And yes, I know it's not Marchant because a descendant corrected me once in public. So I know that it's Marchant. There's still a Philadelphia descendant. Lincoln during his White House years, was a sucker for a request that he posed to commemorate the Emancipation Proclamation. He knew that was his doorway into immortality. He believed in the proclamation. He believed in he called it the grand act of the 19th century. So here is Marchant, they proposed that they do a painting for Independence Hall, linking us to America 250. Lincoln had spoken at Independence Hall on the way to his inauguration and said, "I would rather be assassinated on this spot than ever to surrender it." So the building meant a great deal to him. And by the way, it never made it to Independence Hall. It made it to the Union League Club in Philadelphia, where it still resides. But it did inspire a print, several prints that were used in the 1864 campaign. And it is a print of Lincoln as the, quote, great emancipator. You see there's a statue which actually says liberty. It's a statue of liberty with the shackles around its feet symbolically broken. And Lincoln, that terribly drawn right arm, is holding a feathered quill, the likes of which he had not used for 30 years, to sign the little document on the table, which is the proclamation. Marchant decided that he should dress Lincoln in a white tie rather than his customary black tie for this painting, because he didn't like the way it looked, black ties look, and he thought this was a major moment. Lincoln signed it in an ordinary black suit. So this is the signing. Actually, there's a sad story about it. Marchant asked Lincoln if he could give a leave of absence to his son, Henry, who was a soldier. And and allegedly his assistant in making the work. I don't know if he really was, but Lincoln granted the leave and then extended it. And it was the last time that the artist ever saw his son, because Henry, the young merchant, returned to the army and was killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville. So there's a rather tragic aside to it. It actually looks better in person than it does in reproductions, but it was a major work. Emancipation works were popular, and this one appeared as a piece of campaign literature in time for Lincoln's reelection campaign.
Because this is done in 1863.
It's done in 63, and the prints come out in 64.
And it must be said, he looks very calm, and this is very stately, but it's a very fraught moment, and many people are angry at him for signing the Emancipation Proclamation.
That's what people don't realize, that it was controversial. And maybe, the fact that he did 100 days notice between the preliminary and final documents gave people a chance to think they could influence the final outcome, and it created...
Errol, do you think the quill pen and the Independence Hall destination is hearkening back to the signers of the Declaration?
That's a great point, Jim. Not only do I think that makes a lot of sense, I think I will probably use that in my next description of the picture. But I will give a very small footnote to your incisive
But if
analysis.
you look at the Gilbert Stuart portrait, and I mentioned Gilbert Stuart because he trained Marchant, there is also a quill, and there is the Constitution.
That's a
so
good point.
It's
Yeah.
definite. He's putting him in the lineage of the founding
I'm glad you
fathers.
mentioned that he had studied with Stuart. Marchant was one of the older painters to most of the guys who did Lincoln, especially out in Springfield, where you had to take a journey from the east, were young. And this fellow was older than Lincoln. I don't think that had ever happened.
This seems an apt moment to pause in our deliberations and open the floor to our wonderful audience.
I've always been under the impression that if you were a quote-unquote educated person in the 18th or 19th century, you knew the Bible, you spoke Hebrew, Greek, Latin, etc. So was this particularly unusual, or was this fairly common for someone of Lincoln's stature?
It's a great question. Yes, there was a great deal of familiarity with the verses in the Bible and the verses in Shakespeare, to the extent that, Shakespeare was very, very popular. The same way we know the Hamilton libretto, people knew Shakespeare. So when there were references, they got it. The astonishing thing is that Lincoln committed so much to memory. People would recognize the tone of these passages, but Lincoln really, really had them down.
I wanted to add there too. So Byram being a contemporary to Abraham Lincoln, he was known to having one of the best and greatest libraries in Sag Harbor, and wonderfully a inventory of it survives in the inventory of his estate that was taken in 1881, and he has Shakespeare in there as well. So a really well-read individual who was a voracious reader of Shakespeare, other travel logs, ornithology, all sorts of things. So he also read Shakespeare.
I can draw the line with Lincoln at ornithology. That was not one of his. That's one of the few things he wasn't interested in.
But the gentleman said something key, which was educated people, and all of these gentlemen are autodidacts. So they didn't get to go to Andover and learn Greek and Latin and the Bible.
I think we should also point out that it wasn't entirely about print culture, that a minister is preaching from the gospel and interpreting scripture every Sunday, sometimes for hours at a time. And people would attend those services 52 weeks a year. In some ways, this was the intellectual life of a community. And the preachers were actually public intellectuals. They're not just presenting people with the texts from the Bible, but interpreting them in a kind of coherent philosophical system or faith system. So at a time when there weren't other vehicles, I think that the oral culture was also very oriented around the Bible as well.
Lincoln had to run against a minister to get to Congress, a Democrat named Peter Cartwright. And in those days, candidates would go to each other's events and then respond at some later time. But Cartwright was at a huge gathering in Illinois and was very ministerial when he was running. He said, all those in the audience who are going to heaven, please stand up. So hundreds of people stood up, and they said, now all of you who are going to hell, please stand up. And 30 or 35 sheepish-looking people stood up, and that left only Lincoln sitting. And Cartwright looked down from the podium and said, Mr. Lincoln, I see you're not going to heaven or to hell. Just where do you think you're going? And he said, if it's all the same to you, I'm going to Congress.
It remains to be seen whether it's heaven or hell these days. Any other questions?
How did Lemuel Haynes get a hold of books, or how did he educate himself, considering that he grew up on a farm? Where did he get access to books?
It's a great question. We don't know quite what was in that farmhouse, the farmhouse he was adopted into and raised as really a member of the family. We know from quotations in a biography of him that he regarded the woman in that house, Elizabeth Rose, as a maternal figure, and that she paid a lot of attention to his education. But we don't know quite what books were there. We do have a sense, though, that he was an avid reader when he had the opportunity to gain access to books. But it's one of the mysteries of, especially because the father figure in that farmhouse was blind. And so I'm not sure how big a library he would have assembled either. So, but with all of these people who are autodidacts, it is this amazing question, because they tend, and I would include Frederick Douglass in this, they tend to have been omnivorous in turn whenever they had access to anything they could learn from, or they could have access to reading. And there's some inner drive that makes them intellectually alive in that way.
There are a lot of contemporary descriptions of Byram during his lifetime. There's a great history of Long Island by Benjamin Thompson, and he talks about how he didn't come from this great educated family and that he actually really struggled in school quite a bit and was a terrible student at mathematics, and so was someone who was very much an autodidact and taught himself through reading and just exploration of the natural world as well. So very interested in flora and fauna and things that are probably coming off of the whale ships from all over the world. He had a sea moss book, so was very interested in natural history and all sorts of topics that I think he just voraciously consumed himself and just taught himself, which is pretty amazing.
Is there an archive around Byram? He must have corresponded with people. And then the other question is, he's right there where the ships are going and coming and going. Did he travel?
Yeah, those are really great questions. So the archive that does survive around Byram, which I am trying to track down right now, there is an account book that is at the Sag Harbor Whaling Museum, which is for later on in his life, which documents a lot of his clock making the tower clocks. There's a tower clock account book. There were letters and other primary documents that survived with a family friend. I don't know where those are right now, so I am trying to track those down. There are allegedly a lot of letters in there. A lot of his career is documented through the newspaper, through other types of publications, and you can really get a sense of him too just through his library as well, and how he educated himself. He had 48 volumes of the Scientific Journal of America and other navigational treatises, so all sorts of things, and so that's how he's learning. But unfortunately, there's not a ton of letters and other sorts of primary material, manuscript material that I've been able to get my hands on just yet, but I know it's out there, and hopefully that can work towards building a greater story of understanding how he learned to create these extremely precise instruments that really withstood the test of time and were celebrated and compared to what could be created in Europe. Something else that comes up in a lot of the descriptions of himself and his life is that he suffered quite a bit with illness throughout the entire course of his life. He lived a very long time. He died in 81. And they do talk about, which I think is interesting to think about him and his interest in the celestial world and worlds beyond his own, is that he hardly traveled outside of Sag Harbor, actually. The only things that took him away were when he went to New York City to build the tower clock there. He would travel to the city periodically. He did go to Rochester, where he built a tower clock. He did build tower clocks in Kentucky and also Virginia. So he did some traveling to put up those clocks, but not an enormous amount. They always talk about the fact that he never really strayed far from home, despite having these, otherworldly interests.
So I wanted to turn it over to you for any final comments about what these figures have to teach us today.
Lincoln taught us, and I think we have the responsibility to secure his interpretation of the American dream. He taught us that this is a land of opportunity, without realizing there would be a further battle for democracy and opportunity after 1865. But we may have to continue that fight.
In one of your talks, you said it was unimaginable what he went through, that the electoral college vote might be problematic. You gave this talk in 2009, and here we are again.
Yeah, there was the expectation that there would be a riot directed against the Capitol.
Yeah.
Unimaginable during the counting of the electoral vote in 1861. What they did is they brought up cannon onto Capitol Hill, which should have been an object lesson to prevent a riot and a demonstration during the electoral vote count.
Any final thoughts on Byram and anything he has to teach us just as citizens? Or
I think to just always be curious and to continue to read and to learn and to explore and learn about other places beyond, your own community. And despite, where you might come from or what kind of education you have, there's opportunity in just exposing yourself to new ideas and to always be curious and ask questions.
In terms of the lessons from Lemuel Haynes, I could go on for quite a while. One of them has to do with memory, how important memory is in a society or in a civilization. Somehow we lost our memory of Lemuel Haynes and of people like him in the founding era. Justice Taney in the Dred Scott decision tried to rule out African Americans as citizens, saying they were not encompassed under the Declaration and Constitution at the founding. Our friend Abraham Lincoln stepped forward about a couple of months later and said, that's bad history. Justice Taney has got his history wrong. He's not remembering who was actually there. We have a duty to remember who was actually there. Thousands of people, 20% of the population, like Lemuel Haynes. And of course, if our students today aren't aware of that, they have no sense of who's included historically in our founding and the fiber of our society. I think the other lesson that's perhaps really apropos now is of resilience and of faith, because in his lifetime, Lemuel Haynes lived in Vermont, the first state to ban slavery in 1777. He saw northern states in the 1780s and 90s passing gradual emancipation acts. He could really, by 1800, have felt the country was on a roll. And then he would watch that roll get completely unraveled and reversed in the 19th century. And by the time he died, the South was ascendant, the slave economy was ascendant. Politically, the hopes of people wanting to end slavery were set back. But his children lived to see Reconstruction and to see a better future. He never lost faith. He was always an optimist. He was a Calvinist, and he believed that there was a God who would make this right eventually. But I think that's the most important lesson, not only his resilience, but his continuing to have faith in the Republic.
well, I want to thank the three of you for helping our country with its memory and with preserving our sacred history and our rich and diverse history. And thank you to the Armory for allowing us to be in this beautiful historic space, which also should give us hope because it was once a fortress against riots. That's why there are crenellations, and now it's a center for arts. And I'm wearing a little Knickerbocker gray pin that belonged to my grandfather. It's from 1898. Trust me when I tell you he didn't expect his granddaughter to look like this. So the arc of the universe does bend towards justice. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much.